Platte Clay Electric Cooperative supports local schools, takes an active role in economic development, and works hard to keep costs down for its members. Visit www.pcec.coop. Platte Clay Electric Cooperative.
The Kearney Historic Museum opened in 2006 to celebrate Kearney's sesquicentennial. It is home to several permanent and rotating displays. A favorite among residents and museum guests is a full timeline of Kearney's history beginning in 1856 when David T. Duncan and W.R. Cave laid out the town and named it Centerville.
I think one of my favorite things is on the wall behind me is a timeline, the progression of our city from 1856, when it was called Centerville, up to current. I really find that very interesting. You can kind of see how things progress. And it's one of those things that kind of shows how time marches on is the phone call service. When the first unassisted phone call was made in 1960, I always thought that was kind of an interesting thing because we take phone service for granted. But it was actually a big deal at one point in time. Hey, you can dial your own phone call without having operator assistance. So I always felt it kind of showed how technology and advancement, things that we take for granted today, were actually a big stepping stone in years past.
The museum shows how early residents were first able to make unassisted telephone calls and also displays pieces that were important to their everyday lives. Visitors will see models of the first post office, the Kearney Trust Company bank lobby, and a display from the old drugstore.
I decided to choose some of our drugstore displays because we have had drugstores here since the day we became Centerville and then Kearney. And in particular, one piece that is part of our drugstore display is a little postcard that was from Mr. Shackelford, our druggist. And Mr. Shackelford in June of 1888 was sending off to Kansas City for 5 boxes of firecrackers and 1 box of fireworks. With this being July and we celebrated our Independence Day, I thought that this was a good thing. He was willing to pay cash between $5 and $10, and this was the city's display that year. So it's a good thing that the city of Kearney budgets more than $5 to $10 for their fireworks display. But these are the little tiny bits and pieces of Kearney history that you will find in this museum. And this postcard from 1888 is one tiny piece of this big drugstore display.
Railroads and highways have been a major factor in Kearney's development. Interstate 35 became an essential part of Kearney's economic growth. The late Mayor Bill Dane envisioned another growth phase as city residents passed approval for a second entrance ramp at 19th Street and I-35 in 2019. But before cars became a dominant mode of transportation, trains were the way to travel to distant locations like Omaha, Kansas City, and Chicago. When the railroad came to the area in 1869, John Lawrence laid out a town he called Kearney right next to Centerville. Centerville and Kearney eventually merged to become one town composed of 3 churches, 8 stores, a flouring mill, and a hotel.
We like to think that Kearney is here probably because of the railroad, because the Hannibal Bridge in Kansas City was completed in 1869. And they wanted to go from Kansas City to Chicago with the stock, livestock and grain and all that. So anyway, this was the good route because we had a creek here, Clear Creek, and the steam engines could stop and get their water. So that's the reason. So, and at that time, the president of the railroad in Kansas City was Colonel Charles Kearney. And we think that this is probably the reason why they named Kearney. Kearney was laid out in 1869, why it was named Kearney, maybe because of him. And his wife is, her last name was Harris, and over at Westport now there is a Kearney place and a Harris house. And we think it's probably after them.
The Kearney Historic Museum is a fascinating window to our past. The railroad, Black Angus and Hereford cattle, and row crops were driving forces of industry. At one time, Kearney was known to sell the most cattle per square mile of population than any place else in the United States. Our town's history is alive and well here at the museum. Stories and events are retold by staff, volunteers, and residents. Kearney residents enjoy looking at the many maps stored at the museum and locating where their home is now. It's fun to imagine what their neighborhood looked like in the past and compare it to how Kearney looks today.
I like to come through and look at the old maps in Kearney. This one here, for instance, this is the township back in 1898. So I like to look at the streets that I'm familiar with now and look to see which houses were back there and maybe figure out who used to live there that I know at this time. So that's always been very interesting to me.
There's a lot to learn at the Kearney Historic Museum. Jesse James Lore brings visitors from all over the world to the museum and his birthplace home just east of town. The Kearney Historic Museum owns the safe that Frank James' ashes were kept in at the Kearney Trust Bank from 1915 until his wife died in 1944. Families and school groups travel from all over for a chance to see and learn about life in early Kearney. The museum sparks the curiosity of children and adults alike.
My favorite thing about the Kearney Museum is the swimsuit section because you get to see the evolution of the fabrics and different materials that were used and designs and how all of them evolved throughout the years, and I think it's kind of cool.
One of my favorite things is this luggage rack. I love, to be frank with you, mostly I love that it's beautiful. I think it's super vintage and gorgeous, and I love that about it, but it does vary in terms of how old the luggage is. So, you're not just looking at one time frame of luggage. And then the cart itself, when train stations were more of a thing and Kearney was a huge train town, this is what they would use to carry the luggage back and forth. And it's just so beautiful, demonstrates a lot of Kearney's history, I think, in one spot.
The Kearney Historic Museum is located in the heart of Kearney at 101 South Jefferson Street and is open on Fridays and Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Group tours are now available. For more information and reservations, please call 816-903-1856. The museum rotates exhibits quarterly, so there is always something new to see. The Kearney Historic Museum. Experience our window to the past.